Welcome to Al Bernstein Unplugged on Boxing. In a 40-year Hall of Fame career, Al has chronicled some of the greatest moments in boxing history. On this podcast, you get to hear him expand on those memories and talk about the current news in the sport of boxing. You'll also hear Al interview some of the biggest names in the sport. Here's Al Bernstein Unplugged.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another show. We're happy that you joined us. On this edition, we're going to have some fun with your questions. I'm going to answer a bunch of the questions that you have posed to me on Twitter. And we also will be talking with Stephen Espinoza, the president of Showtime Sports. And we're going to find out a little bit about his views about boxing returning and talk a little bit about his role as the leader of Showtime Sports, where I make my living. My co-host on this show, as you know, is Mr. Trip Mitchell. And Trip, I managed to do this interview with Stephen Espinoza, which we already have in the can, and we'll be showing it on this episode. And I didn't get fired after it, so that means it was successful.
I would say you did a wonderful job, and you didn't watch any Mike Wallace outtakes from 60 Minutes. You were not hard-hitting, but it's
right. There was that. Mike Wallace was not going to be the person I channeled for this interview, but let me caution folks that it is intriguing. We didn't go just for softball stuff. We tried to get a lot of interesting comments from Stephen about the way forward for boxing.
Well, if you think about it, now with gates not being very important at all, TV partners are really going to be the reason that boxing moves forward quicker than virtually any other sport. So Stephen Espinoza's position at Showtime, he is one of the leaders in the boxing industry, and his guidance is going to be super important.
Yeah, like as with the other platforms and with all the promoters, they are going to help determine the way forward for the sport. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that in just a few moments. And some of that has to do with the questioning that we got. So why don't you fire away? Tell me some of the questions that we got from our listeners.
Okay, and I did have to put the glasses on. I'm embarrassed to say that happened.
There you go. Good idea.
Great first question, Josh P. Al, who was your favorite fighter as a kid?
Yeah, that's an easy one to answer because I started watching boxing. Well, I really had two, but one supplanted the other. When I was listening as a kid to, I used to stay up late and listen to the Ingemar Johansson, Floyd Patterson championship fights with a transistor radio near my ear when I was like 8 or 9 years old. And Floyd Patterson was a favorite of mine. But the man that really became my favorite was the great Sugar Ray Robinson, who I saw fight on the Friday night fights, and watching with my dad. And it's a bittersweet memory for me because my dad passed away just a couple years after that when I was about 12. But we used to watch the fights, and when Sugar Ray Robinson came on, it was a very special evening. So Ray Robinson would be my all-time favorite fighter to this day, and certainly was as a youngster.
And isn't that great that it's a memory that you shared with your dad?
Yeah, that's part of the reason why it's so special. And you know, Don Dunphy, who announced all those great fights, who I later became friends with, and he was a mentor and a friend to me. I got to, at the 25th or 50th Ring Magazine anniversary, where they named the greatest of all different genres of fighters, et cetera. They named the boxing broadcaster, and it was Don Dunphy. He asked for me to introduce him and present him with the award, which was a huge honor. And when I did that night, really the only thing missing for me was my dad, who would have been, very proud to see that.
That's fantastic. And, what would be fun is to listen to fights now on the radio. And obviously it's never going to happen again. Yeah. But the old days had to be wonderful.
I did one fight on the radio, and you'll never guess who I did it with. Jim Rome. He was the play-by-play announcer. I think it was in Palm Springs, and I want to say it was Meldrick Taylor was involved. I can't remember who the other fighter was. And we did a radio broadcast, so that was pretty crazy.
Did he let you say anything?
Yeah, Jim was good. We had fun together.
Okay. The next question is a great one. This comes from Brad White. What fighter's legacy was the most damaged by their dubious act? Duran with the no mas or Tyson biting Holyfield's ear off?
It's an excellent question, and here's my answer to that. Neither. And I think I can, maybe some people would disagree with me. You might, some other people might, but I actually think that both those fighters have almost completely escaped ignominy from those two actions, which at the time were huge. When Roberto Duran just kind of stopped in mid-fight with Sugar Ray Leonard, something to this day we've never gotten quite a satisfactory answer to. People were not only astonished, some were outraged. They just couldn't imagine that happened. And the same is true when Mike Tyson bit Evander Holyfield's ear. It was, a pretty shocking thing to happen. But here's the thing. If you think about how people perceive those two, those are never the first things that are mentioned, either in a story about them or even in a commentary about them. And let's juxtapose that to some other athletes. Let's take somebody like Bill Buckner, who was a great Major League Baseball player, not just a good one, a great one for 16, 17, 18 years. He's this far from the Hall of Fame, just a notch. But because Bill Buckner wasn't a superstar, that ground ball that goes through his legs in the World Series is the thing people talk about all the time with Bill Buckner, and they sometimes ignore the fact that he was a brilliant player. So I think superstar status and kind of a cult following and having, that kind of passionate following will sometimes take away the faux pas that you commit. And I would suggest that it has done both for both Tyson and Duran. So I don't think it really ended up hurting either of their legacies.
You set me up doing an interview with Jim Gray one time and said, I want you to interview him for the show and you'll like him. And I asked him, what was the most difficult question you ever asked an athlete? And he didn't skip a beat and he said, why did you bite his ear off?
Yeah.
And I'd forgotten that Jim he had a lot of courage there.
Yeah, that's a pretty hard question to ask, isn't it? Yeah. Why exactly and probably a question you never thought you would have to ask, right? So.
Did they teach you that in journalism school?
No, I don't think any of us learned that in journalism school.
Okay. And then, hold on, your final question. Top Rank, comes from Brett Capelli, and Al, Top Rank has announced a possible June card in Vegas with Shakur Stevenson most likely headlining in a non-title bout. Do you think that any big fights will happen anytime soon without fans?
Well, I think they're going to be title fights, like the Jamel Herring fight. They don't have an opponent, I don't think, yet for him. Or Shakur Stevenson, I should say. Jamel Herring also will be probably doing a title fight within the next couple of months. I expect David Benavidez, the 168-pound champion, to be defending his title. And I think that in the next 2 to 3 months, we'll see Jose Luis Ramirez, and probably against Victor Postol, maybe, if they can work that travel out. The man he was going to face before we had to shut down due to the pandemic. A little later on, I think we will see matches that might be a little bit higher echelon in terms of their broad-based appeal. Fights like the fight between Gervonta Davis and Leo Santa Cruz, and some other big matches. But for now, for the next couple months, we're going to see championship matches. I think we'll see some really nice undercards with really good, hopefully, filled with good fights that people will enjoy. That's very important. Whether they have big stars in them or not, it's important for boxing to come back with fights that are competitive and down the line, so that you get to show 2 or 3 of those kind of fights. So we'll see what happens, but I do believe that's going to be the case. Well, we mentioned that one of the people who will be responsible for bringing back that boxing is a gentleman who is the president of Showtime Sports, and I had a chance to chat with him, Mr. Stephen Espinoza. Let's listen into that. Stephen, thanks for taking the time to visit with us. You have been one of the people that I think has provided a very optimistic voice in the last several weeks about what you see for boxing coming back, and I'm sure that includes Showtime, but for the sport overall, what is it that's kind of making you optimistic about how the sport's going to return?
That's an excellent question, because I've talked to, spend more time talking to boxing writers now, because we all have more time to do,
right,
a lot of things. And that hasn't been the recent history of the sport. I mean, I think I've said it in interviews before that that all of us, fans, media, executives, we're pretty hard on the sport.
True.
There's it's a little bit of a cannibalistic attitude.
Mm-hmm.
But I think part of that is because of just the speed at which everything moves. Everyone is hyper competitive, and things are changing, and there's a lot of shifting ground under people's feet. So what makes me optimistic, I think most of all, is the fact that we have right now a chance, those of us who are fortunate enough to be healthy, obviously, have a chance to catch our breath and slow down from running from one event to another and jumping on planes and things like that. And, in periods like that, in periods of not just downtime, but periods of stress and rapid change, which is what we're seeing, that's when innovation happens. And we've seen it on the NBA side. NBA may be pushing their schedule and going to a different time of the year. MLB, it may be experimenting with more postseason teams. So this is the time, I think, where people can get really creative and think about, hey, this is a reset button. It's a reset button for how we all approach the sport. And I know you spend a lot of time. You've spent a lifetime in and around the sport. So I know when you're not occupied with watching fights and breaking down fights, you think about the sport.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I think, and I, in our private calls, in our Showtime group calls, I've challenged all of you guys. Let's think about what we can do differently. Let's get creative.
Sure.
And there's no bad ideas. There's no crazy ideas, because we know when it comes back, it is going to look different. So let's experiment. Let's try things at this point, because we're going to have to do it differently based on the circumstances.
And I got the feeling from your comments recently that some of the optimism that you feel, that's an interesting point, by the way, that you can be more creative when everyone's allowed to slow down and reflect, which you don't always have a chance to do when you're in the rat race and trying to get things done.
Right.
The other thing that you've kind of alluded to is that you think we're likely to see, I think you called it a wild ride when we come back, and your point was that you're kind of optimistic that really good matches are going to be made. I assume that means overall in boxing and from your standpoint in terms of Showtime as well.
I think so. I'm optimistic for the sport, and I've heard from some of the fighters, some of the managers, the promoters. Everyone's really anxious to get going, and that can be said of everything. But the boxers are rested. They've been at home. They've healed up nagging injuries, and now I think what people want is big events. I think it's a little anticlimactic if we say, okay, we're back, and it's just a regular fight or a tune-up fight or something. Now, look, not everything's going to be a monster fight. That's just not the nature of the sport, and there are different guys at different points of their career. But I do think that maybe just like we said, this reevaluation can apply to creativity and production. I think it can be to career development as well. I mean, these guys have a limited time to perform in this sport, and I know everybody's anxious. So I don't think people are going to sit around for several months saying, okay, now that we're back, I really want a couple of tune-up fights. That's just not the nature of the fighters that we work with.
That's a good point, because everyone's biological clock is always ticking, and now it's ticking faster because people lost months and months and months additionally of time if you're a fighter. Now, pay-per-view is an interesting question. Doesn't dominate boxing. It's only a portion of it. But we saw that the UFC come back with a pay-per-view that apparently, by all odds, did a large number of sales. One of the questions I guess I was having, and I don't know if that's a conclusive answer to it, is whether people will have enough residual funds to buy pay-per-views. And pay-per-views are definitely part of what might happen in 2020. For instance, there's talk about Gervonta Davis and Leo Santa Cruz, a fight that is very likely and would likely be on Showtime pay-per-view. Do you think the number one, the UFC success shows us that the pay-per-view is feasible, and how feasible do you think it is?
Pay-per-view does entail all the consideration factors you just outlined. And it would be silly not to take into account the fact that, there's, at least 30 to 35 million people who are unemployed right now, and a lot more who are not secure about their future and might have had pay reductions. And just demographically, a large portion of those are probably boxing fans. There's no reason to think that they're not. So, yeah, I think what we do have to do is proceed in sort of in accordance with what the environment is. And what does that mean? Does that mean no pay-per-views at all? Well, I'm not sure, or I'm fairly sure actually, that Tank and Leo could happen without pay-per-view. It just is. It's an expensive fight when you have two guys who are well paid at the top of the card. It just, that's one of the realities. So yes, there is a risk, and it's not just sort of the unemployment and financial security issues. I mean, one of the ways that people sort of justify the cost is they have people over. One guy brings beer. Someone else orders a pizza. One guy orders a pay-per-view, and at the end of the night, everyone has chipped in. And by the way, you had 10 or 12 people over the house. Depending where we are in the fall, nobody knows. But right now, there's not a lot of big pay-per-view parties going on. In some states, sure. Yes. California, Nevada, California, sort of iffy right now, depending on where you live. So it has to be done carefully. But I do think, look, it's going to be difficult to have a really huge pay-per-view. It is, because there's going to be a ceiling on the amount of success you can have when people are uncomfortable financially. So the question is, do you do a fight like Tank and Leo, pay-per-view so that it can happen sooner? Do you wait for the economy to pick up, and who knows when that's going to happen? It's a really tough choice.
Yeah, it's interesting. Will some boxers and some networks and some promoters have to alter their economic model a little bit for the benefit of the sport? Is there a way to do that? Do you sense that there could be enough teamwork to make that happen so that we make sure we get good matches for fans?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of economic changes, to be honest. I mean, obviously, every fight is going to be impacted by the absence of crowds, which looks like
right.
where we're going to be operating for several months at least. So, in that regard, the people who are really getting squeezed the most are the smaller and mid-sized promoters.
Exactly.
And the difficulty is when there's a lot of boxing on TV. We've talked about that. But there's a lot of shows that are not televised, and that is where a lot of the developmental work on young fighters goes. And if there's no TV and there's no gate revenue, those shows aren't going to happen. There is no revenue there, whatsoever. So yeah, if you've got a Showtime Championship event, there's some revenue coming in from a license fee, and even if you don't have the gate, there's still a pie that can be cut up. But the real question, and I think we need to do this. I mean, something like ShowBox continues to be really important, for the development of the sport in shows of that caliber, because without crowds, I think there's a real challenge in terms of fighter development.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's what makes it murky in terms of coming back. Now, you came to Showtime Sports in 2011 to take over the helm of the Showtime Sports division. And you came from a world of client representation, and you had been the lead counselor for Golden Boy Promotions, and you had represented a lot of boxers, and you had a lot of sports ties in addition to your entertainment ties. What was the hardest part of that transition, coming from that world to running a sports enterprise?
Great question. There's, I would say the most difficult was also the most rewarding. And as a lawyer, an entertainment lawyer, you're used to seeing one segment of an event. If I do an actor deal, I probably haven't read the script. Maybe I have. And then, I do the actor deal, the client goes off and films a movie, and 9 months later, a year later, I get invited to a premiere. If we, sell a book, I'm representing a book author that gets made into a movie. We sell the book to a studio, might not hear about it for 5 years, and then, but in the meantime, scripts are being written, and then all set. Here, this process is the first time in my career I've been involved from start to finish, from the idea of an event all the way through the execution. So in some sense, having one sliver of this limited role makes things a lot simpler. I don't have to worry about the film going over budget or shutting down because of coronavirus or other things. I need to make sure my client gets his deal done and he gets paid. In boxing, you're babysitting the entire process, which is a challenge. But then again, when you walk into the arena on fight night, or it's just about to be the walkout, and you see the crowd on their feet and this adrenaline in the air, that's when you realize this was all worth it. All the headaches and all the late nights are worth it.
Yeah, and you came into even though your position at Showtime involves other sports programming as well, the boxing is kind of the most high profile of Showtime's sports offerings. And you came into it as a true boxing fan. You've always loved boxing. How much of an attribute or how much did that help you that you weren't a television guy or a representative all of a sudden now helming a network that does a lot of boxing? You were a boxing fan who now got to think about all the things you've always wanted when you watch televised boxing.
I think it would be very difficult to do this job without really having a passion for the sport. I'm not saying it can't be done, and I'm not casting aspersions on anyone, but there's a lot of frustrating days, a lot of frustrating interactions. There's a lot of disorganization, and so if you don't love it, I think you get burned out pretty quick.
Yeah.
And you look at guys, and often, not to pick on him, but we all know and love him. I mean, a guy like Lou DiBella, Lou gets as frustrated as anybody and as angry as anybody, but where it's coming. Yeah. I mean, it comes from a place of passion for the sport and love for the sport.
Sure.
So, in order to enjoy this position, I think you have to like boxing. It would be too painful otherwise.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. That really is a good point. Now, we have a very diverse group at at Showtime, and
Yeah, I laugh because it is truly a range of personalities. I mean,
you really
if
do.
people only knew what goes on beyond the scenes.
Yeah, and as people as different as you could possibly imagine, who all bring different experiences. I always joke that people sometimes are either senators or governors in life. Like I used to be a governor back when I was a newspaper editor and I ran people. Then I became a senator when I got to be more just a sportscaster, because now I'm just basically, it's like you're like a gunslinger running through the Old West. You stop in this town, you do something, you stop in that town. You're not running a group. You kind of became a governor after an earlier job in which you were more of a senator, where you're doing these individual jobs. So
It's a good point.
Yeah, you have to kind of run this eclectic group of people. Does it help that we have a pretty interesting group overall?
I think my background really helped me prepare for it, because I probably had, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 clients at a time, and they're all different, and they all like to be communicated to differently, and they all have different habits and different idiosyncrasies, as we all do. So there are very few, rarely do you talk to two clients and handle two clients the same way. And I think that has prepared me well. Yeah. So, with you guys, I mean, the way I communicate with Mauro is slightly different than from you, than from Paulie, and, as well as all the groups of people that we talk with. It's just,
all the people behind the camera as well.
Yes. So, and that's what I think one of the underappreciated things is that, people on the TV production side view themselves almost like athletes themselves in a way. We are a team. We're coming out to perform. Our goal is to have a superb performance, and we're all there, sort of adrenaline rushing in the heat of the moment, and have to sort of execute and deliver when it counts. And there's a sense of camaraderie and bonding when you bring all these different people from different parts of the country come together to do something fun and interesting and hopefully enjoyable for the audience for 3 to 4 hours.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It is intriguing because everybody descends on this spot, some from the office of Showtime, some from other places, and the goal is to ultimately reach the goal of putting on a good show. Now, one of the things that, so in our eclectic group, one of the things that a number of people have in common, you are, along with Mauro and Paulie and Brian, and probably a few other folks on the show, quite the devotee of hip hop music. And you guys always discuss it.
I hadn't thought of that yet.
Yeah, you're very into it, and it's ironically, it's the one genre of music that I don't know that much about, but I like to listen to you guys and learn from you. What is it? What speaks to you about that music, and how did you get to be? Because you're more than just a casual fan of it. You are very, very into it. What was it that made hip hop speak to you?
I think it was, I think it was, going through the teenage years when that new form of music was becoming, more popular. I mean, the roots are well before the mid 80s, but the mid 80s is sort of when people started to, early to mid 80s is when it sort of really took root and started to spread. And as a young teenager, I saw himself maturing with the music. It just, and sure, as a 15-year-old, it didn't hurt that, parents didn't like it and people didn't know
That's
what
almost
to do with it.
mandatory,
And all the
isn't
things
it?
that sort of right. Yeah, the same thing that made every teenager love rock and roll when it first started. And then. And then probably where it sort of cemented is when I got to college, when I was at Stanford, I was working at the radio station, doing in the sports department, and they needed somebody it always happens. It's a student-run station, and things come up. They need somebody to fill in one of the slots, not during a sporting event, but when they were doing music. So I started doing a hip hop show at that point, college radio, and that's something I did, all 4 years of college, and it was a really exciting time in hip hop at that point. So that sort of cemented my love affair, I think.
Did you, I never asked you this. Did you represent some hip hop artists when you were in the representation world?
I did. I worked with probably the two biggest. Did a lot of work with Snoop. Okay. A lot of stuff, and Eminem on the acting side. I wasn't a music attorney, but was involved in his 8 Mile deal and some of the stuff that happened after that.
Well, that was a big, that certainly was important. Well, I wanted to, I like to, when I have people on, I love to get a chance to, if people understand or know something about them that they wouldn't know. And I think that's something probably most people would, if they're aware.
No, you've done a good job, right?
What you do, they probably don't know that.
Right. Now can I share all the secrets of all of you guys? Can we?
Sure, why not? Yeah, exactly.
About Paulie's habits at the buffet, or Maura's culture knowledge, and any of those things we can start, right?
Yeah, we are an interesting group, and it is.
Those are family secrets. Yeah, we'll leave them as family secrets for now, huh?
I'm sorry?
We'll leave them as family secrets, I think.
Let's just suffice the genre of music that they like, and we'll leave the rest.
There we go. Yeah.
They might not speak to me again if I bring up too many. You're the boss, so they have to talk to you, but I could be in big trouble.
You're right.
I appreciate you taking the time. In closing this, I know we are getting close to getting back going. What message do you have for the Showtime boxing fans about the immediate future and what's coming up?
Well, I am excited about what's going to happen when it come out, whenever that is. We've got a target date. We're hoping for July. And I think it's going to look somewhat different. We're going to try some things. Some things, will work, hopefully. I'm sure a couple ideas might not, but that's sort of the phase that we're in. And look, I'm excited for the sport. All of us want it back, as bad as anyone. But the real challenge here is, with a group as large as ours, on the production side, Showtime employees, freelancers, on-air commentators, all the stuff that we're responsible for, as well as, on the fighter and promoter side, is, before I ask you and your colleagues and other Showtime employees and everybody, to come into this environment, I want to know that we have done everything we can to make this as safe as possible. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to eliminate all risk. And it's easy to say, well, it's not that bad. But the reality is, in many cases, coronavirus can be mild. But I think thinking about all of us on the team, you don't have to go very far to find a loved one that is relatively high risk, whether a spouse, or you're taking care of your parents or things like that. So, it's a responsibility. And as much as I want to get back, we want to do this in a way that A, is as safe as we can make it, and B, gives the fighters an opportunity to prepare. Because right now, we're in this trend where a lot of states are reopening, the majority of states in some ways. But if we got a full green light right now, that still doesn't mean fights in June. Not if we're going to give fighters, a full opportunity to have a training camp. Because if you were in California or Texas, before, say, a week ago, technically you weren't allowed to go to the gym. So I think July is the combination of, figuring out safety protocols in giving fighters the best opportunity to prepare and get ready to go.
All right. Well, we're looking forward to the return and looking forward to a brisk schedule of Showtime fights after that. And we're hopeful that the sport in general comes back soon. Hey, Stephen, thanks very much for taking the time to do this.
No, great to see you, Al.
All right. You take care.
All right.
So that was my chat with Stephen Espinoza. And as you could tell, Trip, he's a guy that is thoughtful and very intense about the job he holds. And it's interesting to be around him because those are the kinds of discussions that you can get into with him, even at big dinners where we're all together. Mostly it's a lot of laughs and we have some fun, but there's also conversations like that take place.
Well, and how important has boxing been to Showtime? I've read some things saying it's one of the big reasons why Showtime has gotten to the heights they've gotten to.
Yeah, listen, there was a long period where for the premium channels, HBO and Showtime, it was the place where boxing was mostly seen. And it certainly has been very important. Now, in the last couple of years, other platforms have come to play. And some people question how important boxing is to premium channels. HBO stopped doing boxing. But Showtime has always had its subscribers say to them, we like boxing. And they're still doing it. And that's why Showtime is still doing boxing, and it will continue to do boxing as long as that's the case. All right, we got the way of questions.
Okay, we've got a good one here. And I love this one, having done some fights with you. When calling fights, do you use the monitors or do you watch the action in the ring? Following up to that, do you believe it would be good for judges to benefit from having monitors? I always see them struggling to see what's going on in the ring due to obstruction.
Question. Yeah, intriguing. I started out watching the ring back 40 years ago, when I was 10. And that was the case for a little while. And then I started gravitating to watching the monitor because that's what people were seeing at home. And from doing about originally maybe 5 to 10% off the monitor, I kept that figure kept increasing and increasing. And I'm going to say about 15 or 20 years ago, it got to 100%. I have barely looked at this is the weird part, right? I've been sitting at some of the greatest events in boxing history, even in the last 20 or 25 years, except for certain times in between fights, I have barely looked at the ring, which is bizarre, right? I mean, it's kind of crazy. But I've found that it is a better way to look at it. Now, that leads us to the second part of this question. Some people would find it to be heresy to suggest that judges should look at monitors. After all, they're ringside, and there is this thought that you can't tell how hard punches are, how much are they impacting if you don't look at them in real time and in real life. I'm not 100% sure. I'm not willing to say here, definitely judges should be looking at monitors. But I don't think it would hurt because you are always getting a good view of the fight. Better view, I think, than you are if you're just looking through one portion of the rope. So it wouldn't be offensive to me if the judges used monitors. I don't know that that'll ever happen, but who knows? It's possible.
Well, if you look at instant replay in football, special was, super high def. You can see things that you couldn't otherwise.
Yeah,
but
true.
You're opening a can of fish when you do that, however.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if the boxing, which is a very traditional sport, would go that route.
Okay. And this comes from Dustin Cushion. Al, has there ever been a moment while calling a fight, in the heat of the moment, you said something you immediately regretted? If so, what was the fight and what did you say? And by the way, he loves the show.
I've made a couple of factual errors that, I kind of went through my brain to try and scan, many, many fights to see if I could really remember. I'm sure there have been things that I've said in the heat of the moment that I wished I could get back, that I didn't phrase quite the right way, or maybe I was too emotional or not emotional enough, or I didn't zero in. Those things, it's hard to call back. But the things that you did that were not factual, Those are the things that trouble you and keep you up at night. And I committed a terrible faux pas not that long into my career and on the biggest stage of my life. And we were talking earlier about people being penalized for mistakes or whatever. And sometimes you're a Teflon man and sometimes you're not. Well, on the Hagler-Hearns fight, on that fight, afterwards, I was thinking to myself, because I had done the Hagler-Duran fight, and some people thought Hagler underperformed in that fight. And I wanted to say that if Marvin Hagler needed to, if there was any doubts about Marvin Hagler underperforming in his fight with Roberto Duran, he has put that to rest now. Instead, I said if there was any doubt about Marvin Hagler after his loss to Roberto Duran, those questions are answered now. Of course, he did not lose to Roberto Duran. He got the decision. And that night, I didn't even realize I had said it really. And I was kind of made aware of it much later. And I really had a hard time sleeping that night. I said to myself, how could I have done that? But it was a slip of the tongue. And I had a certain thing in my mind, and that came out. And amazingly, to this day, I have received very little blowback about it. Every once in a while, someone will joke with me about it or remind me of it, and I cop to it because it was a mistake. The other mistake that I made that was funny was one night we were doing a Showtime fight from what was then the Home Depot Center in LA. It's been renamed 4 or 5 times. It's the place where the LA soccer team plays, and they have this wonderful round amphitheater for tennis where lots of boxing has happened, and it's been a great venue for boxing. And we were doing a fight, and I was supposed to come on and talk. It had been raining that night, but still a lot of fans showed up. I was supposed to talk about the great fans that had come to the Home Depot Center. And Steve Albert and I got on camera, and I said, it's a testimony to the great fans here at the Home Box Office Center. Of course, Home Box Office being our rival in the sport of boxing. And Steve Albert, always prepared, turned to me and said, I believe you've had your YouTube moment. I said, yes, I believe I have. So those are the 2 things that I wish I could take back. There are probably a lot more, but those two came to mind. So, at least I'm copping to them now.
40 years later, but hopefully fans of Al Bernstein Unplugged, when they see you, will bring up the Hagler-Hearns fight.
Yeah, well, I'm sure they will. Oh, now I'll probably get 1,000 tweets about it. Every once in a while I get some, so what can I say? We are so glad you joined us. My thanks to Trip, of course, for his fine work. Next week, we're going to be having Glenn McCrory as our special guest. Glenn is a former world champion and a very fine broadcaster in the UK. And I've been anxious to have a chance to have him as a guest because he's a terrific broadcaster, great guy, and he will bring us a lot of interesting stories from across the pond and about boxing in general. So that should be a fun episode. Take care, everybody. We'll see you next time.